Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being live streamed and recorded. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Vienna Live with Simeon Moore and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please go to the LinkedIn live video feed, the link to which I have now placed in the chat room. For this show thrives on participant contributions, and all participants are encouraged to actively participate by asking questions and making comments. To do so, please write in the chat room or turn on your microphone, say hi, and we'll be delighted to hear from you. Tonight, our featured guest is Dr. Philip Auslander, Professor of Performance Studies and Popular Musicology at Georgia Tech and the author of Performing Glam Rock, Gender and Theatricality in Popular Music, the subject of which is the subject of tonight's show. Welcome, Phil.
Hi, thanks. Great to be back.
Phil, so tell us a little bit about your generation. Talk about your generation, the society you grew up, and the music that that you remember, the pop music scene that you remember.
Well, I have to admit that even though I wrote this book about glam rock, at the time, that is to say the early 1970s, I wasn't really into glam rock. I was definitely much more the world I lived in, as you said, and the people around me, my peer group, et cetera. We were definitely much more interested in sort of psychedelic rock and things of that sort, the kinds of music associated with the counterculture or things that came, sort of just after that. But we weren't really particularly listening to glam rock, and I actually came to it for that reason kind of late. I mean, I knew a little bit about David Bowie in the early 1970s, and I'd heard some of his stuff, but I was a little behind the curve as far as that went. And I kind of at least caught up with him a couple of years later. But the reason actually that I wrote this book, or one of the reasons I wrote this book, relates directly to that, which was two things. One was I was interested in reading a book about glam rock, and I basically couldn't find one. At the time, there were two books, one of which is a pretty decent book by Barney Hoskins, which was actually published as a tie-in for the movie Velvet Goldmine, the Todd Haynes film. And it's a good book, but it's not a scholarly book. And so that was one reason. And then the other reason was, or the other thing that contributed to it, was because I had been really absorbed into the other kind of music, psychedelic rock and things like that, during that time. This was an opportunity for me to explore something very new, and that I really did not know that much about at the time that I embarked on the project, because it really hadn't been part of my experience at that time.
And Phil, before we get into psychedelic rock, can you just tell us briefly about then musicology, the studies of music? I imagine that before, also, as you said, there was no book on glam rock. Today, you are a considered a pioneering, the authority on performance studies and popular music. But at that time when you were first studying, as you said, there's not a lot of literature. Tell us about what that meant when you're studying. So I imagine musicology was all about Beethoven and Mozart, and you're saying, no, I want to study popular music. What did that entail? What challenges did you face?
Well, I mean, there certainly had been people studying popular music, although I guess at that point, or the point that I'm thinking about, they were mostly not musicologists, right? They were more cultural studies people, communications people, people like that. So there was some of that going on, but it hadn't really taken root in musicology particularly. But also my particular interest, as you said, in terms of the connection between music and performance studies, is in looking at musicians as performers specifically. And of course, the tradition of musicology is not oriented toward performance, it's oriented toward text. musical compositions as text, the history thereof, the analysis thereof, et cetera. Whereas I am specifically interested in performers and what they do in music and in other contexts. So that was another reason that I chose glam rock, because glam rock is so highly theatrical that it gave a good opportunity to really look at and talk in detail about what the musicians were doing as performers, because they were doing a lot. So it was a good kind of case study to try to push that idea forward of looking at musicians as performers.
Okay, so let's take a look now at Jefferson Airplane. They are performing psychedelic rock from the 1960s. And I have to say, we've got several YouTube videos. We may run into some kind of advertisements. If so, I apologize. So here's Jefferson Airplane. Fantastic. So, Phil, tell us about psychedelic rock. When you say psychedelic, to me, from my generation, we think about these tie-dye shirts and something kind of weird. So, tell us, what is psychedelic rock?
Well, I mean, I suppose strictly speaking, psychedelic rock is a subgenre of music that evolved, particularly in San Francisco in the second half of the 1960s. Of course, it kind of spread out from there and became, ultimately a global phenomenon within a year or two. But Jefferson Airplane obviously is a good representative of that San Francisco scene, which is where they came from. And the main thing that I sort of focused on in thinking about this has to do with the way in which these musicians typically performed. Because glam rock, very shortly thereafter, I mean, this particular clip comes from 1970, and glam rock really starts to evolve a year or two later than that. So it's a pretty direct response to what had just come before it, and especially in terms of performance, also in terms of music. We'll talk a little bit about that too. But I'll start with the performance, which is to say, when you watch this clip, you notice a number of things. One is that at the very beginning of it, the musicians are basically in the dark. And actually, Jefferson Airplane liked to perform in the dark. They didn't particularly necessarily want to be seen. Secondly, you also notice that they're not performing to the audience, they're performing to each other. I mean, Jorma Kaukonen, the guitarist, actually turns his back to the audience near the beginning of the clip. And Grace Slick also, even when she starts singing, is not facing the audience. She's mostly facing the other musicians. And they form this kind of circle where they're playing to each other, And the implication is kind of that they're not really there to play for an audience. The audience happens to be there, but they're really there to play for themselves, and you kind of have the privilege of eavesdropping on this, which is very, very different from where glam rock would go, which was highly theatrical, highly oriented toward the audience, etc. Um, I mean, Jefferson Airplane's music itself is actually quite dramatic, but their presentation on stage is very, very anti-theatrical, and I think that's a point of some confusion. I think a lot of people, when they do think sort of stereotypically of the '60s and the psychedelic era, they think that there's all kinds of sort of spectacle that goes along with this, and there was in anti-war demonstrations and things like that. But if you actually look at rock musicians of the time, they were very conspicuously opposing theatricality. And in fact, this was something that was also written about in the rock press of the time. The term theatrics came up a lot, always in a negative context, because the idea was that showmanship was somehow antithetical to the ethos of the counterculture. It was too slick, it was too much, too commercial looking, etc. So that's part of the reason why these performers performed the way they did. I do want to say, though, just to be very clear about all this, that my book on glam rock, focuses on British musicians, because that's really where glam rock happened. It wasn't nearly as successful a phenomenon here in the U.S. as it was in the U.K. And just as a sort of footnote to that, I do want to say that in the sort of British equivalent, or the London equivalent, of the psychedelic rock scene in San Francisco, there were some acts that were much more theatrical than the typical American psychedelic rock act. So there was a little bit more sort of theatricality and performance over there than there was here, even at that point. But the other thing I want to say is, just in terms of the music itself, is that another key element of psychedelic rock is improvisation, and often extended improvisations, typified by a group like, let's say, the Grateful Dead. Not as much Jefferson Airplane. They didn't do as much of that as some others, but groups like the Dead or Quicksilver Messenger Service would go on and on and on, playing for hours on end, largely improvisationally. And this was also something that glam rock sort of turned away from, in favor of typically much shorter songs, much more sort of tightly focused songs that return to a more kind of conventional pop song structure than psychedelic rockers were often inclined toward.
Okay, so let's get right to it then. The man who made this transformation from psychedelic rock to glam rock. So here is a video of Tyrannosaurus Rex, 1967.
Sarah, crazy child, is devouring all the streets. In her plastic torture dress, in her seductive pound so deep. Her skin is white like olive, in her body is bitter sweet. Till she's only just lovely and she's forgotten how to dream.
Okay, Phil, tell us what just happened there.
I love that image at the end of this very hazy club. Okay, so the person in question is Mark Bolan, who is the guy that you saw sitting on the floor playing the guitar, usually on a little prayer rug or something like that. And the group at this point, the group is a two-person group with him and another guy, the percussionist Steve Peregrine Took. And the group at this point was called Tyrannosaurus Rex. And it was this, acoustic duo that was actually quite successful in the context of the London counterculture, which in England was often referred to as the underground. And as you can see from that clip, they played in clubs that were part of that milieu, et cetera. They put out several albums. I think Tyrannosaurus Rex put out something like 3 or 4 albums. And they were, as I say, quite successful within that context. They were also championed by the legendary British disc jockey John Peel, who was very fond of them and really promoted them on his radio programs. And then later was very disappointed with them when they morphed from Tyrannosaurus Rex into T-Rex and became, well, you'll see, became a very showy electric rock band as compared with what you just saw in this kind of vaguely folky acoustic group that's still was very, very palatable. Let's just put it that way to the British counterculture. But in terms of sort of who invented glam rock, it's a tight race between Mark Bolan and David Bowie. I would say, if you look at the record carefully, Bolan probably got there first, but Bowie certainly, his version of glam, went a few steps further, I guess I would say, than Bolan's. But what they had in common, first of all, they were friends, maybe frenemies to a certain extent, but really friends. They knew each other. They kept track of what each other were doing in the late 60s and early 70s. One difference between them, I think, was that Bolan, as you just saw, was really in the late 60s, was more a part of the counterculture. I think he identified with it more and participated in it more than Bowie did. Bowie did to an extent, but he didn't have the same degree of presence in that context that he would have shortly after. So for Bolan, it was really a kind of dramatic shift that he made quite intentionally, because both Bolan and Bowie around 1969, maybe 1970, started to feel as if, the countercultural thing was kind of fading. And that wasn't something that you could kind of keep pursuing into the future. And so they both made this kind of transition into something else. And initially that something else, turned out to be glam rock. And in a lot of ways, it was, for both of them, it was they sort of pursued it in a way that was as opposite to what had been going on in psychedelic rock and in the counterculture as it could be, which I think we'll see more clearly when we see some of the other videos coming up.
Watch it. Okay. This is Mark Bolan, the glam rocker.
More marriages. I wanna go low in my basement. I'm scared to sleep alone. Baby, does everybody here? Oh, baby, does everybody here? I slide up there beside you, but my knife is all too steep. Yeah! Oh!
Okay.
All right. Well, as you can see, that's pretty different from what he had been doing 5 years earlier. So that's from a concert film called Born to Boogie, which was directed by Ringo Starr of the Beatles, and it was shot at a concert at Wembley Stadium. Well, actually, a couple of concerts on the same day, a morning, afternoon one, and an evening one. In 1972. And I wanted to start the clip with the shot of the audience because you can see how the sort of audience fervor for a T-Rex at this point. And in fact, that fervor was equated to the reception that the Beatles had received, Beatlemania, only this time was called T-Rextasy. And so they got that kind of ecstatic response from a young teenage audience, which again was a very different audience from the one that he had been playing for in countercultural clubs, such as the one you saw in the first clip. And of course, Bolan himself has really transformed himself from that kind of seated figure with the acoustic guitar and this very sort of intense but inner directed way of performing to this sort of coming on as kind of the rock superstar. And he's wearing this very glittery jacket. He's wearing a T-shirt that has his own face on it, and sort of the ultimate expression of rock star ego, I suppose. And he prances around the stage, and it's a completely different, much more theatrical, much more audience directed way of performing than certainly he had been doing a little bit earlier on. And also, of course, his singing voice was always fairly eccentric, whether you're talking about Tyrannosaurus Rex or T-Rex. But I think just to talk about T-Rex, I think the artificiality of the way he sang is an important part of this, because that kind of heavy vibrato and other things that he did really come across as a very kind of stylized way of singing. That's quite different from what is at least supposed to be a much more kind of straightforward way associated with psychedelic rock. That kind of artifice is not something that was valued by the psychedelic rockers, but that Bolan sort of brought in. So all of those things, the way he's dressed, the way he kind of prances around the stage, that voice. Also, a lot of the gestures that he makes are kind of classic rock star gestures, some of which he stole from other performers, knowingly and intentionally, I might add. All of that, and the audience itself, the fact that he was now really trying to attract a younger, teen audience as opposed to at least ostensibly older and more serious audience. So all of these are aspects of his version of glam rock, which he arrived at, after or through this transformation from his earlier incarnation in Tyrannosaurus Rex. And of course, he was also perceived, this becomes a very important feature of glam rock, he was also perceived as somewhat ambiguous in gender, or somewhat effeminate as a man. And he played into that as well. And that sort of gender bending aspect became really a central part of what glam rock was about, which Bowie exploited much, much more than Bolan did, but it certainly was already present in Bolan, even just in his voice. And again, this is something that, flew in the face of really the relatively conservative gender politics of the counterculture, which in fact, for all of its supposedly liberatory rhetoric, really was committed to fairly conservative and traditional definitions of masculinity and femininity and the roles that men and women were supposed to play. And so Bolan, and who's the way that he dresses and so on, is already sort of crossing over a boundary between what's stereotypically masculine and stereotypically feminine.
Okay. Let's get into David Bowie then. Here we are performing Ziggy Stardust.
Guitar, jamming good with weird and killer and spiders from Mars when he played it left hand, but he made it too far, became the special man. Then we were Ziggy's band. Ziggy really sang, screwed up eyes and screwed down hairdo like some cat from Japan. Oh, you could kill him by smiling, you could leave him to hang. Well, he came on so lonely, man, seeing the snow white hand. So where were the spiders while the fly tried to break our bones? Just to be a right to guide us. So about his pants and shirt with just his sweet hands. Oh yeah. Ziggy played for time, jiving us. We were voodoo. The kids was just crass. He was the Nas with God-given ass, but he took it all too far. But boy, could he play guitar. Making love with his ego. Oh, yeah. Chicken sucked up into his mind. Oh, like a leopard messiah. When the kids had killed the man, I had to break up the band. Oh yeah. Now Ziggy played guitar.
All right, so that's, I think, from 1973, and it's from the D.A. Pennebaker concert film documentary called, I think it's just called Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. And that particular concert was a significant one because at the end of it, David Bowie actually announced that, well, he made this statement saying, not only is this the last show of the tour, but this is the last show that we'll ever do. And what he meant by that was that he was moving on from this Ziggy Stardust persona that he was portraying and had been portraying for a couple of years. And certainly you can see it very clearly in this concert and even in that clip. that he was ready to sort of do something different, which he did, although it took a little longer. There were a couple more things he did, which were still kind of hanging on to Ziggy Stardust, and then he did move on to something quite different. But this statement was misinterpreted by the people who heard it, by the music press, and so on, as meaning that David Bowie was never going to perform again, that he was retiring from performing. And all he meant was that he was retiring the Ziggy Stardust persona. But I think that in itself says a lot about what he was doing and its relationship to rock culture, because from the point of view of sort of the idea of authenticity in rock culture, that David Bowie is Ziggy Stardust, right? The two things are inseparable. And if what Bowie was thinking, and he had actually said this very clearly in a number of interviews over a couple of years, what his way of thinking about it was basically the way an actor thinks about a role, that this was a character he was playing, and he was going to stop playing it, and he was going to move on and play something else. And he also had said along the way that he thought other people could play Ziggy Stardust because it is a character after all. And none of this makes any sense in the context of rock culture, where the idea that the figure on stage at a rock concert is a fictional character being played more or less by an actor just doesn't make sense in terms of the ideas of authenticity that surround rock music. That the person on stage has to be real. It has to, you have to be able to believe that this is a real person presenting their authentic experience, performing authentic rock music, etc. And Bowie really was not doing any of that. He had a very, very different conception of what a rock concert could be, of the idea that portraying a fictional entity as the main thing on the rock stage, et cetera. And I think it's safe to say that nobody had ever really seen this before. I mean, even Mark Bolan wasn't doing exactly that. I mean, he presented this very stylized version of himself, but it was still a version of himself, whereas Bowie was really portraying something else, right? A different entity, in all kinds of ways. I mean, through costuming, through makeup, and through his very stylized gestures, and choreographed way of moving on stage. Even I have to say that Bowie in 1973 didn't have the budget and didn't have the means available to him that he would a few years later. And of course, over time, his concert tours became much more, or ever more elaborate and complicated and highly theatrical, involving all kinds of sets and props and whatever, which he couldn't do at this point, which is a fairly early moment in his career. But still, even in that clip, you can see how staged and how theatrical this presentation was for a rock concert. There's that nice shot where you can see all four musicians on stage, and you can see that each one is lit in a different color. They're arranged in this very symmetrical pattern on the stage, and each one is lit in a different color. And so that kind of thing, of really paying attention to the details of the staging and using those theatrical means, was something that I think Bowie really brought to the performance of rock music. There are also some other interesting things that he did. So, for example, there are four musicians on stage, including himself, but there were at least 3 or 4 other musicians who were off stage and could not be seen. So if you listen carefully, for example, you'll hear a piano, but there's no piano on the stage. And so there's this kind of mysterious other musical voices that come into it, who are, where exactly it's coming from is not at all clear. And then there's one great moment later in this film where Bowie sort of suddenly points off in a particular direction, or faces and points in a particular direction, and a saxophonist appears in a spotlight that we didn't even know was there previously. And so it's this very dramatic moment. It's highly staged, very dramatic moment that, again, I think is something Bowie really brought to the idea of rock performance. And I think, in a lot of ways, much of what has happened since, in terms of these very, very elaborate stage productions that people like Lady Gaga and Katy Perry and many, many performers now, even hard rock groups that use a lot of pyrotechnics or things like that. I think ultimately this all goes back to Bowie and this kind of theatricalization of rock performance. So yes, a lot, you can sort of see similarities between what Bolan was doing and what Bowie was doing, but I think it's pretty clear that Bowie kind of pushed it further, in terms of the theatricality of it, in terms of also the gender bending aspect, right? I mean, all the very elaborate hair and makeup and feminine looking costumes and so on. And I do love that moment at the beginning of this clip where he's standing and these hands reach out and pull his clothes off to reveal another outfit underneath, which is again a highly theatrical moment, unprecedented in terms of rock performance. And I don't even know. I mean, I haven't really looked into this, I guess, carefully enough, but I'm not sure if before David Bowie, rock performers ever changed costumes during performances, but he did. I mean, there are multiple different costumes that he wears in the course of this concert. And he would sort of disappear from the stage at a certain point and come back in a different outfit and so on. And I'm not sure that there were other rock musicians who were doing that at that time. So I think today's highly theatrical way of performing pop music, at least in some cases, ultimately really is traceable back to him. And obviously he sort of grabbed a hold of this kind of gender play that Bolan was also engaged in, and moved it even further than he had.
Okay. Are there any questions from anybody at this moment? Yeah, I guess I have one, Phil, about you mentioned in the book exactly that about musical theater and how that was so anathema to the rock culture, this pop culture, I guess, of the post-war, of this psychedelic rock and all that. They wanted everyone to be exactly as they were. They didn't want anything staged. They saw that as somehow part of the system, that they really did not want anything to do with theatrics. So that's why they're all wearing clothes like anybody else. Tell us then how what that connection is. Kind of point that out to us with David Bowie, with Mark Bolan.
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question.
Yeah. So that those connections. Can you tell us again about the parallels between the music theater and what we've just seen, and the how that music theater then became, as you said, became part of all common mainstream in rock?
Well, I guess what I was trying to point out, if we go back to Jefferson Airplane for a minute, and you can contrast what they were doing, the way they were presenting themselves with either Mark Bolan or David Bowie, in the way that they, again, they don't play to the audience. They basically are playing to each other. They even have their backs to the audience and so on. Whereas both Bolan and Bowie, just a couple of years later, were brought back a kind of showmanship to rock performance that had been there previously in the 50s, even in the early 60s, but then the psychedelic rock era sort of turned against all of that. And then the glam rockers like Bolan and Bowie and many, many others. I mean, I would say if you wanted to identify one kind of characteristic that's present in all of the different things called glam rock, that kind of sense of showmanship and theatricality of sort of playing to an audience, that's certainly a common element. As is sort of high degree of artifice in terms of the presentation of the figures on stage and the staging of the concert itself. And as you just said, I mean, none of that was what the countercultural types were after, which they perceived it as sort of inauthentic and fraudulent. And I think that on the part of particularly people like Bolan and Bowie, what they were doing was intended as a reaction against that what had just come before them. And particularly in Bolan's case, since he had been a pretty active participant in that was a fairly radical change for him that he undertook. And I mentioned earlier that the disc jockey John Peel had been a champion of Tyrannosaurus Rex, but he was not a champion of T-Rex. he was very disappointed in Bolan and this sort of whole turn toward, first of all, electric guitar playing, more of a teenage audience. I mean, all of these things he just felt Bolan had sort of sold out the counterculture. It's interesting that Bolan, if you watch the whole film, you'll see that there's a period, sort of a part of the film where Bolan takes out his acoustic guitar and sits down on a rug and sort of starts performing again like Tyrannosaurus Rex. And it's almost like a kind of apology, I think. It's sort of like, I'm not doing this anymore, but here's a little taste of it for those of you who still need it, like John Peel. Peel was not appeased. I mean, he was done with Bolan at that point. But it does, I mean, that contrast does speak to just how radical a departure this was perceived to be at the time, and also in terms of the kind of gender performance going on within it, which again is something never to be seen on the stage of a psychedelic rock concert.
Okay. Any other questions, or should we move on? Okay. So we're going to watch now a Suzi Quatro performing. Okay. So Phil, tell us about Suzi Quatro.
Well, Suzi Quatro has an interesting relationship to all of this. First of all, she is the only, I would say, I have said, the only canonical female glam rocker. People argue, in the past, people have argued with me about this at conferences and whatever, but I stick to my position. And you know, in one way, um, the gender bending aspect of glam sort of goes the other way in her case, right? Since she is a woman, it's a sort of masculinized female image as opposed to a feminized male image, which people like Bolan and Bowie were doing. Um, Suzi Quatro is also American, but she's had most of her career in the UK, where she's very well known and iconic. And here she's really hardly known at all, except that she did play a character on the TV show Happy Days. She played Leather Tuscadero, who I believe is the Fonz's cousin or something, in a number of episodes. But aside from that, she's never really had the kind of presence in this country that she had in the UK. And prior to moving there, she had been in a number of all-female sort of garage band type rock bands, often with her sisters, because she comes from a musical family in Detroit. So that sort of, the idea of the gender ambiguity going the other way it was sort of part of how she found herself kind of in the mix of glam rock. There are also people who sort of divide glam rock into kind of two categories by making distinctions between the artier people like David Bowie and Roxy Music, for example, and the more purely pop-oriented ones like Suzi Quatro and a whole list of other people. I'm not that fond of that distinction, because I think that everyone really ultimately is trying to get to the same audience. So I'm not sure that really makes that much difference. But certainly her music is more kind of straightforward pop oriented than, let's say, Bowie's. Maybe not Bolan, I don't know. But the thing that's interesting about her is that, in a way, on the one hand, because of her sort of masculinized image, she kind of fit well into the glam rock moment, and became sort of part of that wave in the UK. At the same time, though, from her own point of view, I think she actually does see herself much more in terms of sort of the authentic rocker, but an authentic rocker that's modeled on a sort of previous idea of what a rocker was. I mean, her explicit model, which she has talked about, is Elvis Presley, basically. And so, I don't think she is as engaged in the kind of overt, sort of artifice that Bolan and Bowie both were. But at the same time, her sort of using the image of Elvis Presley or a 50s rocker to define herself, again, first of all, brought about this kind of masculinized woman, which fit into the glam rock gender ambiguity thing. And also the kind of music she was interested in making was evocative of a kind of earlier time before psychedelic rock, and much more kind of straightforward rock and roll, or pop song structures or things like that. And this was another thing that kind of came up in the context of glam rock as part of this reaction against psychedelic rock, and also emergent progressive rock, which is even artier than psychedelic rock, and more complex. Glam rock was challenging those sort of notions of complexity in rock music, and in one of the ways that this happened was by reference back to the 1950s, and sort of the rock and roll era, which took a lot of different forms depending on which artist you're talking about. I mean, Bolan, for example, does this a lot. A lot of his songs are either 12-bar blues, or they're based on, make specific reference to earlier rock and roll songs. So he was doing that in a somewhat submerged way. Bowie to a perhaps lesser extent, but then people like Suzi Quatro and a whole bunch of other groups who are quite successful at this point in the UK, especially, really kind of look back to the 50s and early 60s for earlier styles that could be kind of counterpoise to what had been going on with psychedelic rock as a kind of counter reaction to it. This was also, of course, beginning around 1968 and through the early 70s, there was a much more general cultural renewal of interest in the 1950s, as manifest by, for example, Happy Days, right? And so this aspect of glam rock really fit in also with that larger. I'm not even sure where that came from exactly, but that larger sort of enthusiasm for the 50s that was suddenly manifest between about 1968 and 1975 or so. Maybe a little bit less than that.
Okay, so Phil, now as we for our last topic, let's talk now about. We'll watch a video by Lady Gaga, so from 2011, and then let's talk about the legacy of glam rock today. Here's Lady Gaga.
You taste like whiskey when you kiss me. I would give anything again to be your baby doll. This time I'm not leaving without you. He says, sit back down where you belong, in the corner of my bar with your high heels on. Sit back down on the couch where we made love the first time, and you said to me, there's something about this place. Something about lonely nights and my lipstick on your face. Something about my cool Nebraska guy. Yeah, something about baby you and I.
Okay, so Phil, tell us about this. Tell us about this legacy.
I chose this video for a specific reason. Well, actually, two specific reasons. But of course, it's not a concert performance. It's a music video. And the song is a sort of odd one because it's basically a country song. And it's not necessarily quite typical of much of what Lady Gaga does. But in any case, the two things that you do see here very clearly are, first of all, the Lady Gaga that you see walking down the road wearing these sort of outlandish couture fashion things, and which is something she often does. But and then of course you see two other versions of her in the video. There's the blonde woman playing the piano, and there's the sort of rough-looking guy sitting on top of the piano, both of whom are Lady Gaga. So this idea of role playing, right? Of sort of there's no like authentic figure here. Everybody is playing some kind of role, or in the case of the figure at the very beginning, is so covered over with fashion accessories that you can't even see the person underneath. And then, of course, the gender bending aspect of it, which Lady Gaga pushes even further by presenting herself as both a man and a woman in this video. And that the male figure, that person sitting on top of the piano smoking the cigarette, is a version of herself called Joe Calderone, who also appears in other contexts. There was a time when he accepted an award for her at an award show, etc. So this is this sort of male alter ego of Lady Gaga. And so, that's certainly carrying on that kind of gender bending legacy of glam rock. As is her, her appearance in several different roles, as is that very elaborately disguised character at the beginning, and her engagement with fashion, which is something that she shared with Bowie, certainly. I mean, all of that are things that she has carried on, I think. And if you do look at her concert videos, you can see the degree of spectacle that she's involved with, which is often quite extreme. In itself is carrying on that legacy of theatricality that glam rock sort of brought to the table. But as I said before, I really do think that the whole kind of theatricalized approach to performing rock and pop music that we see now, really across the board. I mean, everything from, as I said before, kind of spectacular uses of pyrotechnics in heavy metal concerts, to the kind of elaborate staging that someone like Lady Gaga or Katy Perry uses, But even, sort of somewhat less extreme or less overtly artificial or extreme examples like Billie Eilish, there's still a lot of sort of stylization, characterization, and so on going on in her performances. And I really think that all of this, all the different forms of kind of theatricalization that we see now in the performance of rock and pop, ultimately is traceable back to glam rock and to a large extent to Bowie in particular as a key figure of really pioneering the idea of the rock concert as a theatrical event, I think.
Thank you so much, Phil. Let's see how we can stay in touch with you. So here is your website, auslander.lmc@georgiatech.edu. Can people reach out to you and can
Of course.
they get in contact with you? Okay, fantastic.
Absolutely.
So here we also have his books, and as you can see, there it is, performing
There it is. Yes,
glam
with
rock.
David
So
Bowie on the cover. Yes.
So there it is, and you can purchase it here. There's the link to the University of Michigan Press. It's available. Again, that's auslander.lmc.gatech.edu. And feel free to reach out to Phil if you have any questions. And I'll put that right now in the chat. There it is. So there is Phil's website. And thank you so very much to Dr. Phil Auslander.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So let's see what's coming up next week on Vienna Live. We have here, it is Moving Beyond War and Building a Sustainable Future. In the early 1980s, a dynamic group of citizens from Palo Alto, California, became concerned about Cold War talk that victory was possible in a limited nuclear war. These citizens focused their talents and resources on creating an educational vehicle, which they called Beyond War, a New Way of Thinking. With a curriculum both hard-hitting and hopeful, Beyond War sent people into a diverse grouping of states to do living room evenings, which encouraged participants to think deeply about two broad and at the same time seemingly radical principles, first of which, the destructiveness of nuclear weapons had rendered all war apps obsolete because any small war could draw in the major powers. And two, we are one human family supported by one interdependent, interrelated life support system. On the basis of such principles, Beyond War was able to pull off an extraordinary set of peace-building projects that included the first satellite uplink connecting all continents to celebrate the 5-continent peace initiative. Beyond War worked to balance the stark truth of the challenge with the optimism of taking on the basis of interdependence and goodwill. As the Cold War wound down toward the end of the 1980s, Beyond War added the climate crisis to its concerns. Survival requires action on the basis that we cannot continue to make war against each other and the Earth's biosphere. Come welcome to our show 4 of Beyond War's key officers, Winslow Myers, Libby Traubman, and Margie and Tony Lee. That is next Wednesday. Moving Beyond War, Building a Sustainable Future. As always, all information about upcoming shows is available at www.simeonmoro.com. Once again, thank you so very much to Dr. Philip Auslander. Thank you very much to we have here, thank you very much to Victoria and Frederick Mulligan for their support of this show, as well as Agnieszka and Benoit Rivolet. Thank you most of all to you, our participants who make it all worthwhile from New London, New Hampshire, and Atlanta, Georgia. Goodbye, and see you next Wednesday.